It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Harlan Patch, who's an assistant research professor in the Department of Entomology at Penn State and in the Center for Pollinator Research. He's also director of pollinator programming at the Penn State Arboretum, and is going to give a fascinating talk about how we build biodiverse pollinator gardens.
How's everybody feeling today? Oh, that's what I like to hear. Because I'm going to fill your brains up. Okay, you're awake. I'm going to tell you a lot of stuff. We're going to start in the Cretaceous. We're going to come up to I'm serious. And we're going to come up to right now. We're going to do that. I want to tell you about why pollinators are important, why pollinators and the plants they pollinate are when you talk about biodiversity on the planet, certainly terrestrial biodiversity, they are the little machines that make it all happen. They're why we are here as a species. I'm not going to go into that story because that's a wonderful story. I don't have that much time. Then I'm going to talk about the principles associated with mostly creating pollinator habitats, but they're also relevant for conservation of habitats. How we think about pollinators, not as individual species, but as communities, that's fundamentally important. And then how we created our garden at Penn State, which was based on all of the scientific principles. It's a garden built from the science up, right? Yes, we use science to build it. And there's concrete and wiring and all those other things. Center for Pollinator Research at Penn State has about 30 to 35 pollinator scientists at it. We all just kind of came. In 2006 was a big year for pollinators because, you remember, 2006 when colony collapse for honeybees occurred, and even if you're a native plant person or a native pollinator person, that was when politicians and the public started to really think about pollinators very broadly. People were thinking about that in the 1990s with biodiversity, but that's when things really got going. We started to get phone calls at Penn State from the government. We're not very far from Washington, D.C. We got calls from the military. What should we do about the pollinators? It really, it's a golden age of pollination science, not for necessarily great reasons, but it is a golden age. It was also the year that the National Academies published the status of pollinators in North America. We learned we didn't know very much. And so it has really led to the golden age of people trying to study landscapes and pollinator diversity and natural history, as well as all the sort of organismal disease problems and pesticides that we have. That's a long preamble. Sorry, I know, that's a lot of flowers. I know, it's amazing. That's just a few of them, right? There are a lot of flowering plants on this planet. And the reason they're so diverse and so extraordinary is not because they were made for human beings. Most of those are for the brains of animals, right? That's how you talk to the brain of an animal that you want to come and hang out with you. And most of those are for insects across the world, even this great diversity. And it happened because of this relationship. This is a very important relationship that evolved during the Cretaceous period about 100 million years ago, a little bit before 100 million years ago. Just the relationship between a plant that can't move around and an organism that can move its pollen. So this relationship in which the organism, the bee in this case, benefits from the nutrients it can get from this plant. It gets pollen for its protein and lipid, which I'll talk about later, and it uses nectar for its carbohydrates, its basic energy source. And there's a lot of complexity in that, but that's the basic story. And the flower gets somebody who can remember it and have a lot of fidelity to that plant, so you get more efficient pollination services. And that's what drives this great diversity. It's a big part of it. There was a time before flowering plants. I know you don't want to go back there. There was a time before flowering plants. I'm not going to go into these details. There was what I'm calling here the age of the gymnosperms. There was pollination. There's wonderful research done by Conrad Labradera and other people looking at the pollination services of lacewings, beetles, scorpion flies, fascinating things associated with non-flowering plants. But it really occurred in the Cretaceous that you had this huge terrestrial change. Partly, you get this mutualism going on, and you can have this. That's when species exist in a relationship in which each benefits, which I just described to you. The pollinator gets something, the plant gets something out of it that's beneficial in an evolutionary sense for their fitness. You can also get coevolution. Coevolution where species influence one another's evolution. Changes in the organism and changes in the insect and changes in the plant, right? That mutually reinforce each other and drive this huge machine of diversification. So if you look at the Middle Cretaceous, this is the kind of thing that happens. This is called the angiosperm terrestrial revolution by one of my colleagues at Penn State, Peter Wolf and his colleagues. And if we had lived, is this there you go. If we had lived at this time, we'd probably be walking around going, my God, the gymnosperms are disappearing, these angiosperms are terrible, they're going extinct. We'd be very sad about this. This happened for a lot of reasons. There's evolution in leaf vein density, stomatal density, all these kind of things. But what this does is if you look here, you see this great expanding of these lineages of insects. We talk about other species, but this is just looking mostly at insects. There are changes in mammals, etc. This huge change. So this is not just pollination, this is also herbivory. You get a lot of diversity of plants, a lot of diversity of flowering plants, and there's a lot of diversity of herbivores eating those plants, right? But you get something else. This system, the angiosperm system, is a system that ultimately gathers more energy from the sun and turns it into biomass, okay? So you get lots of fires, actually, towards the end of the Cretaceous because there's a lot of biomass accumulating. This is also the period when, before the Cretaceous, most of the diversity on the planet was in the oceans. Now it becomes on land. These plants also create something that you're dependent on, which is fruits and nuts, right? Which a lot of other animals become quite dependent on. So it's this machinery that drives biodiversity in terrestrial systems, in most terrestrial systems. So if you want to care about biodiversity, you should care about pollinators and flowering plants. So that's what our world looks like now, right? Right? We went from a world where you had to look at, ugly gymnosperms. They're actually really cool, right? And very interesting. And now you have these flowering plants. And they're everywhere where basically plants can grow, right? They're not in Antarctica, but they're basically everywhere else. And they flower like crazy, and they look really wonderful. And then at the very end of this period, right, the Earth is getting cold. Throughout the Cretaceous, the temperatures in the ocean drop about 30 degrees Celsius. It gets really cold now. The history of the planet is that there's no ice on the planet. That's most of it. It's quite cold now comparatively. And we evolved at the very end of sort of that period, right? We sort of came around, and then we did this to the world. So that's in Munster, in Germany. There are parts of the world where the habitats have been profoundly changed. The upper Midwest in the United States and Canada, the Central Valley of California, and parts of the Netherlands and Germany, sort of the northern tier of Europe. We can talk about places in India and China as well. But this is what's basically happened. So I defy you to find the flower in this picture. Where is it? It's right here, something like that. It's hard to see at this angle, but it's about right there. There's a flower. What you find when you go across the planet, if you travel a lot, is you see these kind of landscapes. Now, this kind of landscape has been farmed by humans for probably thousands of years. It's quite altered and very different from what we have in the United States because of the history of the land. We find species loss, we find decline in abundance of species, and we find community homogenization. It's not that everything disappears, but things become very similar to one another. I'm not an ecologist, I'm more an organismal biologist, but if you're an ecologist and you travel, you go, wow, this city looks just like that other city I was just in on this other continent. Things start to look very much the same. So what do we do about this? That's the question. What do we do about this? And I'm going to tell you a few ways to think about it. What if you're a species like this Agapostemon? I think it's Agapostemon texanus, I believe. If you're concerned about a world that has few flowers that this species depends on, what do you do? What would you do? What do many of you do? You plant flowers. But which flowers do you plant? Because this species likes these plants. These are the actual plants that this species visits to collect its pollen to feed its offspring, okay? But if you're not this species, and you're this species, that's a really good-looking syrphid fly, right? That syrphid fly visits these plants, right? Now, if you look at these plants, they have little yellow flowers and little white flowers. Many of them smell kind of bad if you get really close to them. Flies like bad-smelling things. Even flies that visit flowers, kind of like them stinky. And these plants are not particularly charismatic to humans for their gardens. I work a lot with green growers who grow perennials and annual plants, breed them, think about them. We know what the industry looks like. If you go to a big box store and buy plants, and even if you don't, if you go to the most boutique, distant from town grower who lives by the mountain, you know, that kind of person, I know you all do that, right? You're looking for that guy. The plants we like have really large flowers. They tend to be very red in color. We are quite unique amongst mammals and our relatives, the primates, because we have evolved a third cone in our eye. We see red, others do not, and your dog does not see in black and white. They see color ranges that are similar to us, but we also see red. We tend to like red plants a lot and purple plants. That's not what these plants are. And very few of these plants people plant in their garden. They can also be quite unruly, hard to obtain, etc. So we have certain tastes, but they do as well. For them, this is what really supports their survival and disappearance. I'm going to tell you how to think about this some more. So let's talk about what plants are and how they function in pollinator communities. I'm going to break it down into these parts, tell you how we think about them, what we understand about them, and how we did some research on them, both us and other people. I'm going to talk about the advertisements of the plants, the flowers, particularly the structure, the visual cues, the chemical cues, because they're all very important, and then the rewards, the nectar and the pollen, because that's also very important, and how it's different between different groups of plants and even individual species. The size and form, you know about this, right? This is something you learn in middle school, probably elementary school even, if you live here in Denver, because you guys are doing great things here, and I think everybody knows a lot about plants and just walk around and talk to folks. You know, depending on what kind of mouth part you have and how big you are as an organism, if you're a butterfly with, so long proboscis, you can stick deep into a flower. If you have a very superficial mouth parts, like a sponging mouth parts of a fly, it depends which flower you can use, right? Are the nectaries very deep or are they very shallow? Also, how big are you? That really matters how you can get involved in a plant. So this is the same Penstemon digitalis, and that is an agapostemon, not the same species. You see how this agapostemon works the flower, right? Kind of going in sideways. I don't know, are you really touching the reproductive parts? I think so. But bumblebees, because they're big, have to just hang right out there, right? So bumblebees really got to hold on, they got to stick their head deep in there. And of course, flowers position their pollen in very specific places. There's a really wonderful study, and I don't know if you know it, I think it's in South Africa. There's a single species of bee that's a very important pollinator in that system, and different species of plants depend on it, and they stick their pollen on different parts of his body, right? Some on the middle of the head, some on the abdomen, etc. So plants really want to get the pollen in the right place, and if you're not the right pollinator, it's not going to work really well in terms of what the plant wants. And of course, color is very important. As you all know, you see in a certain color range, and I told you you see red. Human vision flowers look something like this. Bees will see a pattern that looks like this, and butterflies see something different. Let me just tell you a little bit about the differences even between these very large groups of organisms. So this is humans. So humans are here, right, at the top. We see those three color ranges. That's our three color cones. They're tuned to a certain frequency, and they have a certain spread here in what we can see. One of the really cool things, I'll tell you about it in bees, and I'll tell you about humans, because it's going to, if you don't remember anything from this talk, you're going to remember what I'm going to tell you right now. Bees and other arthropods see into the ultraviolet, right? We do not see the ultraviolet, neither do many other species on the planet, although even in the oceans they see the ultraviolet. And they, of course, do see in our red range, but they don't see as much red as we see, as much red in that band, right? So they're going to see very differently. This is actually what bees more like. This is from Lars Chitska's fantastic work. They see a kind of purple color. You can see it here as a purpley blue. They see parts of green, so they see green. This is so partly we think that they can distinguish the flower from the green background they're usually in. And then they see in this ultraviolet, which is shown here as black, because there's nothing in your brain that you can think of what ultraviolet may look like, right? But what happens is our brains don't just pick up the natural environment as it is. They mediate it. They get rid of information. Your brain gets rid of the information it doesn't need, but it also focuses on things and reinterprets it for you. Doesn't mean it's not there. Doesn't mean you live in a fantasy world. So what happens is your cones wrap around. So bees also see a color sometimes called bee purple, which is a mix of green and ultraviolet, right? But you do that too. You do that with your blue and red cone, and you see purple, although purple is actually not a color in the Newtonian light spectrum. It's a trick of your brain. It's actually not a color, right, in the physical world. Exactly. If you just look at families of flies, flies are the second most important pollinator in the world globally after the bees. They are particularly important here. As you go up the mountain, you'll get more and more flies. I'll show you a little bit of those numbers in a minute. In places that are cold, at high altitudes, that's where the flies dominate places. Bees are warm-loving creatures. They love deserts and drier places, chaparral. Flies are pollinating other places. They see different parts of the spectrum depending on what fly groups they are. And even in the syrphid flies alone, which are very important pollinators, even if you're in the same genera, you may see different spectra. You may ask me how we know this. You can't ask flies what color they see, but you can put, this sounds diabolical, you can put electrodes in their eyes and measure from their eyes. You can also tell often how the eyes are structured, what wavelength they may see in, but it's very detailed work. And sometimes you can do behavioral assays with them if they behave in your apparatus. So they see different parts, right? They see different wavelengths and experience a different world, pick out different parts of it than you do. Nectar also varies. Nectar in flowers, if you go to most flowers, most nectar is just like water. A honeybee is concentrated down. They dry it down so it doesn't spoil. But it varies in all these different ways and even more. In the sugar type, the concentration, the volume, the amino acid, the secondary plant compounds are what gives it different tastes, right? If you get honey of different flavors. I'm not going to go into all of this, right? This is a whole class. You take pollination biology, we'll talk about it all, but I'll just talk a little bit about it so you get the idea. If you just look at preferences, and that's where the band is a bit broader, the preferences of short-tongued bees is to have more monosaccharides, which is fructose and glucose. And the preference of long-tongued bees, this is very broadly speaking, there's always exceptions in different patterns in different groups, but they seem to like disaccharides more, the disaccharide, which is sucrose, right? And you can look here and you can see that butterflies, they seem to like more monosaccharides, et cetera, okay? So there's a pattern to this. This is older work, and I think it needs to be revisited, but I understand some people are working on this. It pretty much holds true. And if you look at families of plants, they're biased in a certain direction as well. This is just a little smattering of plants. Now, anybody who knows about plants knows these are massive families of plants. They contain hundreds and hundreds of species, but they seem to have a directionality. So if you only plant plants in the cabbage family in your landscape, you're only going to be able to have certain kinds of pollinators in that landscape, right? If you look at nectar volume, you'll notice that things like bats and hummingbirds like really high volume, and things like small moths and small bees like less volume. Why would that be? I usually like to walk around a lot. I'm having a really hard time. I like to walk around and point at people and put them on the spot. Why? For energy. If you're a large organism, it's just straightforward. You need a lot more energy, so you want to get more bang for your visit, right? Get more food for your visit. In some bat flowers, bananas, not the ones you eat, those are Cavendish bananas and they're clonal, but in real tropical bananas, and if you ever look at them, go look at the flowers because they're crazy fantastic flowers. Some even have structures that the bats can echolocate off them. They're great. You can almost take the nectar out with a spoon. I mean, it's that much nectar in it. You know, bats have these tongues they have to lap around in there. Otherwise, we have to use little capillary tubes, which is challenging for students. Pollen. We have not known much about pollen. Now, pollen is fantastically complicated tissue, if you want to call it that, a plant tissue. Pollen has a coat on the outside called the pollen kit. It's got lots of compounds in it. In animal pollinated plants, certainly insect pollinated ones, it tends to be fairly sticky. Wind pollinated less so. It's not quite true, but it seems to be a general pattern. Of course, inside the pollen is the DNA for reproduction. It's the male gamete. The pollen protects the DNA from the ultraviolet light from being disrupted, right, in a terrestrial system. It's a very important terrestrial innovation to have evolved pollen. But pollination evolved from pollen eating. Beetles probably early on, and then other species, but pollen eating to the point where they didn't just eat all the pollen up, but were also transporting, and that was sort of the switch. Bees are vegetarian wasps. So bees actually evolved right from the middle of the wasps themselves, and they saw the light and became vegetarians. And they feed, so wasps, of course, feed their offspring caterpillars, right? Bees feed their offspring for protein and lipids. They feed their offspring pollen, right? They just switched. It was ubiquitous in the environment. It's a great idea. We often think of bees as being of these three types, if you want to group them ecologically. So generalist bees, they tend to visit basically a lot of families of plants. Specialist bees, just sometimes one family of plant, and sometimes these definitions, authors define these somewhat differently. And monolecty is unusual, in which you have a very tight, these are bees that occur in Europe. This association it tends to be quite rare, certainly in our kind of world. So most bees are either polylectic, most tend to be, or oligolectic. They visit just a few plants, one plant family. This is some research that was done in the lab by Anthony Valdeau. Anthony was very interested in, so there's a lot of patterns that ecologists have observed over time. And it was been very clear to ecologists that insects don't just visit plants willy-nilly, and they tend to be very specific. Sometimes it has to do with the time they emerge, their phenology of the insect. But other times it's very clear in a complex landscape, say when in sort of high summer, when a lot of things are blooming, they have their preferences. They also have competition. What Anthony did, because he was an excellent grad student, is he put a bunch of native plants from the East in a hoop house, in a closed hoop house, in a grid. He grew these plants up and let bumblebees fly inside the hoop house, and he followed the bumblebees all day long to see what was going on and which plants they preferred. And what he found is they really liked the American senna. That's the number one. And he's a great grad student because if he had gotten up at 10 o'clock in the morning, he would have never seen this pattern, because by 10 o'clock, the pollen in the senna was gone. So if he would have just said, that's the least attractive plant. They don't care about this plant. In fact, they exhausted all the pollen. Plants push their pollen nectar at different times of day. It's not always sitting there. Once they finished that, then they went to the spiderwort, and then they went to the Culver's root, etc. And a lot of experiments later, and we did a lot of manipulations of pollen, and we looked at bees in Europe, and we did all this kind of stuff. It turned out that what the bees were really going for is a 5-to-1 protein-lipid ratio. Not for protein, not for lipid. They wanted a 5-to-1 protein-lipid ratio. They're cryptic specialists. This is a kind of specialization that was not obvious at hand, because if you watch a bumblebee fly around during the day, they actually visit a lot of plants. In fact, what they do if they don't have exactly the plant they want, maybe a co-evolved plant like the senna, which has very nice structures for bumblebees. It's the right size, with the pollen goes in the right spot on a bumblebee. It has exactly their favorite protein-lipid ratio. Otherwise, they rail it. They eat a little bit of this and a little bit of this till they get to their target. So Anthony says this might be a great pattern. So we had a bunch of folks who work at companies that grow native plants, for landscape restoration. We worked closely with Ernst Conservation Seed in Pennsylvania. I called it chicken picking, because they just sit and pick the anthers off of flowers. You need a lot of anthers to do this analysis. So they would have tables of these flowers, and sometimes anthers are really small in some of them. And they found patterns. So Anthony found, well, I'll just show you this. So there's Apis mellifera, that's the honeybee, that's its target. This is Osmia cornifrons' protein-lipid target. And up here is that going to be Bombus impatiens? Yeah, Bombus impatiens at the top. You can see certain families of plants, as I was showing you before with the nectar, it's similar. If you wanted to support, just from this data, Apis mellifera, you'd probably want to choose plants like this. Now, Anthony can't be held down, and after he left the lab, he ran up into the mountains because he likes to go on walkabout. And in the Sierra Nevadas, this is just stuff Anthony's been doing. He gave me permission to show this. It's not published yet. And this is just a teeny part of a very great study. He found that these are the plants that this is a totally natural community, sort of unaltered by human beings, sort of a mountain community. Anthony did the same thing, but outside of his hoop house. He was really happy he got to go outside. There's modules. It's not just that they have certain associations, that certain bees and certain plants associate with each other, and they have certain protein to lipid ratio targets. And you can see here's a 3.5 target, here's a 1.2, which lets you know that if you want these plants or these pollinators, the pollinators tend to go extinct before the plants, you're going to have those two relationships. So it's quite complicated, right? You can see it's quite complicated. Okay, so I've added this in a bit about perennial plants, about garden plants, because people are interested in perennial, annual plants. You want to talk about honeybees and all that. I'm not going to talk about honeybees, but we can if you want, if you're up in arms about honeybees. Another student in the lab, Emily Erickson, working with the green growers, as I was saying before, looked at perennial plants, and she also did annual plants, but I'll talk about the perennial plants. Perennial plants in what's called series. So when they produce a series of plants for production and sale, they tend to grow them, as you can see here, with this echinacea, and the series will have like a white one, a pink one, a yellow one, etc. We love working on these plants because they're essentially clonal, so we know the genotype is controlled. We put them in soil medium, so they're not growing in the open ground. We controlled that. So basically, all we're looking at is the community effects on those plants in controlled plots that are gridded out and randomized, okay? And Emily sits on a bucket, and with a notebook, on a notebook, and looks at bees and other things that come to flowers. And this is what you get from this kind of study. A lot of people do this kind of stuff. And you can just look at this and say, just amongst the Agastache, you can see that certain cultivars, like Blue Fortune and Funiculum, are really much more attractive. And you can see here she was looking at beetles and flies and butterflies and other things. And you can see that these are pretty bee-dominated. And some things, like the echinacea, which everybody has as their garden plant, actually these don't support, and this is from other work too, don't support a huge amount of biodiversity, if that is your concern. They do support bees, but not a huge amount compared to this Agastache, which is just fantastic. So that wasn't enough because people do a lot of this work, and we knew there would be differences. We were interested in what the patterns would be between the different cultivars. But so what Emily did is that she measured all the phenotypes of the plants. She measured the floral area, she measured the height of the plant, the color in different parts of the plant, including in UV, all the morphologies. This is the kind of panel you get. Don't try to understand this. You can weed through this. She collected a lot of data. She was also interested in the monosaccharides, the disaccharides. She looked at the protein-lipid ratio. She was lucky to be downstream of Anthony's work, so she knew how to do this by this point. And you can see there's a lot of variation, but I'll try to... She looked at all the plant volatiles. So she collected all the floral volatiles from these plants as well, because of course we know they're important in attraction. And this is what she got. Now, I'm not going to parse this for you in this talk because I'm giving you a very high 35,000-foot view of this stuff. What she found that for all the genera, the height of the plant was the most important, which is not going to surprise you, right? Tall grass prairies keep growing up taller, right? You got to compete with each other. You can't be this tall when all your friends are 4 meters tall. It's not going to work well. You got to play well together. She found that things like scent for the beetles, just the diversity, the beetles and the flies, just the diversity of the scent, not what was in it. But as with butterflies, they had a single compound they seemed to be really attracted to in her system in what she was doing. She also looked at all these effects I'm not going to get to you of the nutrition on and that she saw patterns. The amount, say, for bees was quite important overall. She parsed out the bees alone, and you can just look at the different species of bees up here and see they were tuning into very specific things, which if you work on bees, you know that they do this. They're partitioning those resources actually at a very fine scale, and what they're being attracted to cannot be generalized, even within genera, it doesn't seem, in this system. So, okay, that's very complicated, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. You're like, what are we going to do? This is where it really matters. So Emily just took her plants in her system, and she said, what if I took my low attractive plants, and I looked at who comes to them, and my high attractive plants. So this would be if you only had, I think this is 6, if you only had 6 plants you were going to put in your landscape. Now, if you're planting a meadow, that's not for restoration, that's going to be under a solar site or something, you're going to have 15 species. You're not going to have 300 species of plants, right? You can't get them. You can't afford to do that. It's not going to be possible. It's already expensive at 15. If you're really lucky, you can get to 30, right? Say you're planting 6. So you have to make choices because money and time, space are limited. If you choose these 6, you can see she supports a huge number of species in this community, including things, kleptoparasites and stuff, that are kind of special for this community. If she chooses those 6, right, she basically only has the most generalist species in the landscape. So what plant you choose really makes a difference. It's not higgledy-piggledy, and in fact, for bees, it can be very specific. So this leads me to my first rule, which is that if you're creating or maintaining pollinator landscapes, the family, the genera, the species, even the cultivar diversity really matters. The identity is very important. We will get to a place in the future where we'll have, just as I was showing you here, have high levels of sophistication about who goes with whom, who supports whom in these kind of communities, right? We're on that road now. Right now I can just tell you plant a lot of flowers and a lot of diversity, right? That's what you do. That's all. I'm going to give you a couple of other things, and I'm going to go over these rather quickly for the sake of time and not in much depth. You need a high coverage of flowering plants, majority local native species, and I'll try to tell you why that is the case. Pollinator relevant habitat composition and consideration of the landscape context, which is no surprise to folks who live in Denver, Colorado. High coverage of flowering plants. This is a study done in the UK, looking back over time of bee declines. In the UK, they have long time records, obviously going back to the middle of the 19th century, and they can look at these blips. Each peak is disappearance of species or species over time. And these authors attributed these declines to various things. Very early on in the 19th century, they started using a lot of guano. Guano is good for nitrogen. It's entirely organic, but increases your soil nitrogen. When you increase your soil nitrogen, does that favor flowering plants or not? No, you know. It favors grasses. And when you keep putting the nitrogen in the system, it favors grasses. They also, there was a decline in rotational cropping. They were starting to tear out hedgerows at that time. This led to these blips because there was floral declines. When you go to the UK today, you see it's all grassy and stuff. A lot of that has to do with grazing, of course, but a lot of it has to do also with the use of nitrogen in the soil over very long periods. Then the Haber process for synthetic nitrogens. The intensifications around World War I and World War II were very huge for bee declines, and that was just landscape conversion. That's going on as well before, just landscape conversion, wetlands being used for growing crops for the war effort and all that kind of thing. The blip here at the very end, we're not sure why that is. It could be due with neonics, but some people there don't think that's really the case. Okay, this is a really wonderful study that was done across 4 British cities by Jane Memmott and a group of folks. It was a 10 million pound study, so really large. And a great group of ecologists, understand it was a great fun, traipsed all through these cities. They went to the parks, the cemeteries, the verge, the little green spot of grass between the road and the sidewalk. And they found that this is actually a measurement of robustness, which is a community measurement. You might think of it like the integrity of the community. It's not quite right, but they found that the allotments were the places that you had really the highest community robustness. They had a lot of species going on there. And it's even higher than the nature reserves, which would be the case in the United States. Why do you think that was? These allotments, these are like little plots you can have by the side of the railroad. They're 10 by 10 or something. You grow your vegetables and stuff in it. Exactly. It was biodiversity. Because everybody's doing something different. I'm growing cabbages. You don't come, you grow weeds, right? All those kind of things that go on in these plots. That's what is great. And what the great thing about this is, so the gardens, English people love to garden. It rains all the time. You can grow anything there. But the gardens are homogeneous. They grow similar things in the gardens. But in the allotments, they don't. So what the story is? You just have to tell people, do your thing, but don't be like anybody. Like, get weird, right? So you're like, I'm from Boulder. I know how this works. So that's what you need to do. There needs to be a so all of you I know, and I've talked to some people, those are doing these community efforts. get people to do different things in different places with different stuff, right? That's really important. Okay, majority native species, and focus on the core generalists. Now, this is a big topic. And this is not natives because they're great or natives because they're important or history or anything. It actually has a very important functional relationship. So one is timing, and you've heard of that. You see this for bees. At different times of in the year, if they're nesting or and when they're foraging and those kind of things, or going to overwinter with some species, they need certain kinds of resources at those times, right? This is just their life history. And you're used to seeing these kind of things, right? So plants through the season, you see lists of plants. You plant them and they bloom at different times. They have sort of peak blooms, as this of course for us, but for here you have the same kind of list. This is Anthony's work. This is, I told you got up early before 10 o'clock so we could actually see the bees use the senna. They switch all day long. So this is what the phenology looks like during the day. The bees don't just stay with one thing. As they exhaust one resource or other bees wake up in the community, if you work on bees, you know the first ones to get up in the morning are the bumblebees. They stay very late. They get up early in the year. They stay till the end. Bees join, or butterflies or whatever, join the community at different times of day. And this competition causes them to switch around during the day, right? So there's a structure to it. And our native plants are attuned to this. In our part of the world, we have 2 bee seasons. We have a bee season early in the year for certain genera, usually before May. That's before the canopy of the forest closes. When the forest is in bloom, the trees are mass blooming, the understory ephemeral plants like Virginia bluebells and stuff, which are quite gorgeous. When the canopy closes, that goes away, and you can walk through the forest. It's like a ghost town, right? Nothing's there. No insects in there. They're all out in the open field. Most people think of pollinator landscapes as meadows and stuff like that. They are. They're very important, and certainly for us in the middle and late part of the year. But trees and shrubs are also very important, and there's a structure to this. So depending on if you plant a lot of trees, you're going to have a lot of spring stuff living in your trees, right? Usually. Or woody things, just generally speaking. Pollinator community structure. Pollinator communities are just like, remember in middle school you saw this, right? The little things that the plants did photosynthesis, and there were little things that ate those things, and then some bigger things, and the cool stuff your school mascot was named after, because nobody wants to be called the wood rat, but you certainly do want to be called the western diamondback rattlesnake, right? That's what you want to be. The cool things at the top. Pollinator communities are the same. This is Laura Burkle's research from Carlinville. I would love to tell you about that study because it's really a tour de force, and it showed us a lot. But this is what a real pollinator community looks like. Don't worry about the colors. The red one actually are species that disappeared. This is a study that Laura did in Carlinville, Illinois. 100 years ago, there was actually was a professor of ancient languages. His name was Charles Robertson. He rode around in his buggy and ran Carlinville and collected pollinators from all the plants of the time. And he sent all the insects to specialists of the day, so they were identified properly. And so you can go back and compare his research from 100 years ago to what's going on in Carlinville today. This is what Laura did. It took him 30 years. I think Laura wanted tenure, so she didn't have 30 years to do it, so she just did it for the spring. These are the spring flowers of Carlinville. And you can see they support a lot of pollinators. But what I want to show you here is you see this plant at the top, right, Claytonia, right? Claytonia in this system, we would say, is the most generalized plant. It has the most pollinator visitors, right? It supports the most pollinators. The most generalist bee is this Bombus pennsylvanicus, which is disappearing in a lot of parts of its range. It visits nearly all of the plants in this community. But I want to tell you something I want you to remember. These are the most specialist bees in this system, okay? They only visit one plant. You can see, they only have one box checked. What plant is that? The Claytonia. The most specialist bees in a lot of these systems visit the most generalist plants. It's a nested structure. You think that rare bees visit rare plants, which is true, but that's kind of a special thing. In most places, the generalist plant, now, if you think about it, it's really good if you're only going to be a specialist bee and show up certain times of year, that your plant actually is getting pollinated by somebody else in your system. There's redundancy in the community. They support each other. So, if we were thinking of we can't plant every plant, so let's say we wanted to plant a plant that supported the spring breeze, a group of plants. We'd focus on the top ones here because they're the ones who support everybody, right? These plants down here don't support so much. Now maybe we're interested in those for other reasons, but we can't plant everything. Does that make sense? So we want to support pollinators, certainly on communities we're creating. We focus on the most generalist plants because they support the most. Now there's pollen specialization, et cetera. You also notice that these bees went extinct, they're the red boxes. Many of those are wood nesting bees, and people cut down the big trees, right? This is off the coast of Turkey, and a wonderful study that was done on the island of Lesbos. Just like I showed you with Anthony's protein lipid modules, these are modules for resin collecting bees, and the plants have converged in their color and other patterns to support. So this also has a pattern. So this pattern of modularity also occurs for other reasons, just like I showed you with Anthony's work. So the communities are both nested, where there's redundancy in the system, and they're modular. And there's probably a lot more modularity than we've recognized, because as I was saying earlier, it's cryptic. You need pollinator-relevant habitat composition. So being a cavity nester like a honeybee is relatively uncommon, and that tends to be the social bees. It's not common naturally. We like to say generally, so there's about 1,000 species live east of the Mississippi, 3,000 that live west, 1,000 that live in Colorado, we're going to hear later. I shouldn't steal your thunder, but it's exciting. 1,000 bees, I mean, it's crazy. There are about 2,000 that live in all of Europe, right? This is crazy great. Stem nesters, hole nesters, that's about 25-30%, very broadly speaking. Everything else lives in the ground. What is the percentage of ground nesters here of the bees? 70%? About 70%. So, if you want bees to live, and this is in Germany, if you want bees to live and you want wood nesting bees, which you know they're the ones that have a lot of trouble because people cut down the old trees, the old dried out trees, you can build a structure like this. It's actually full of stuff. It was crazy great. You could hardly even walk close to it. There were still a lot of parasitoids on this one. And it was just like getting covered in fantastic. People make small ones like this. We're actually doing work to see which one of these really work and which species go to this. I was hiking in this is actually in the town of Leukerbad in the Swiss Alps. I was looking at flies, right? They have Edelweiss and all these crazy great plants up there. And this was on somebody's side of somebody's chalet. It's huge. It's the size, as tall as I am. And I had to cross a creek to get it. You know, it was a rushing river thing. And so I go to this person's house, and I get up close to it, and there are no bees in it. I was like, what? This is magnificent. And if you look at the house on the side of this 500-year-old house, you know where they live? I don't know how the house was standing. I mean, these planks are like this thick. This just goes to show no matter what you try to do, the bees and butterflies are going to have other ideas. So follow nature. This is my wife, Christina Grosinger. She's actually the head of the Center for Pollinator Research, and we were visiting our colleague Manfred Assi in Ulm. And Manfred's students were collecting founders bees and doing hoop house experiments, but then they had a pot where the founders bee would make their colony in the pot or put the offspring in the pot. And his students didn't want to just throw the pot away when they were done with the experiment. So Manfred said, well, go down the side of the hill, scrape off the first 6 inches of the topsoil, dig holes, put plastic pots in and cut the bottoms out. And then when you're done with your experiment, just take your regular pot and walk down the hill and drop your bees in there. And guess what? It worked. And so what started to happen, and so the bees kind of like this sort of open area with some little rock structure in it and these little small plants. They love to nest in this kind of area. And what happened is other species of bees came to nest in this spot, right? So we actually have tried to recreate this at Penn State to see if we can get it working, to see if we can actually seed it with bees and have them ground nesting. Any habitat you work on and create, certainly in this part of the world, has to think of this problem. Because you can put $1 million landscape in, and if you ain't got space for ground nesters, you're not going to have anything. That's too much lawn, too much hard space, too much any of that kind of stuff. Consideration of the landscape context. I'm getting to the end here. Emily also worked on annual plants. These are Emily's different sites. These are just 2 different sites. They're about 1 kilometer apart in a very similar habitat to the edge of forests. And these are her same plants. Now remember I told you that these are annual plants and they're basically clones of one another growing in pots. Whatever the height of this, so 3 is very attractive and 0 is not attractive, okay? Looking at this, these are sort of reaction norms. And if you look here at the lantana, you'll find the lantana at site 1 was much more attractive, and the cultivars were different from one another than at site 2. The attractiveness of the plant changed in a different habitat that's not dramatically different. If you look at the pentas, it went in all different directions. The most attractive one became the third attractive one. One of the interesting things, I will tell you the story of what we figured out with the lantana. What happened with the lantana is at that site, at site 2, there were hawk moths. And they're really big bullies, and they chased everybody else out of the flowers. So there were only hawk moths really visiting these plants when you stuck them at that particular site. And the hawk moths did not occur at this other site, just because it was kind of low-lying and a bit wetter. More hawk moths. This lets you know that whatever you plant, your plants are not frozen, right? Although the identity of the plant matters, their identity changes within the context in which they're put, right? So if you plant your plant, so you plant a mint. Mints are very attractive to bees, and you say, there's nothing on my mint in this site, but in this site they are. There's a lot of community differences that drive this. So this is the kind of thing we like to see. So this is in Europe. They've been doing very large-scale agri-eco scheme studies in Europe. This is species richness, bees, and this is flowers in the landscape. 5 minutes. Thank you. Perfect. This is what we like to see. The more plants you plant, the more flowering plants you get, the more bees you get. That sounds great, right? But they found this. If you put in that $1 million meadow and you have less than 1% semi-natural habitat, you get no effect. Because there's no natural habitat left, where the pollinator is going to come from, right? If you get over 20% semi-natural habitat, you get no effect. And the reason is, and this is in ag systems, right, for pollination services, is because you already have so many pollinators in the landscape. And that's certainly the case in Pennsylvania. We don't even put strips in our apple orchards because we already have so many bees living in the landscape. You just manage that landscape well and you get free pollination services. The sweet spot is between 1 and 20% semi-natural habitat. And this holds true, apparently. I've talked to some other folks in sort of other places. No one's ever done it in a place like this. It's a study you guys should do to see if this holds in different kinds of habitats. That's really important to know because you can't put your resources everywhere. You got to pick and choose. You got to figure out where you're going to get the sort of the most benefit for what you're doing. As we all know, it's basic ecology. Moderate landscape use can maximize richness and species abundance. In the sake of time, I'm actually going to talk about Colorado a little bit, but I'm going to skip over it real fast. We can talk about it later, I'm sorry, but there's not enough time. I'm running out of time. You live, this is relative species richness across the world. Bees don't occur in the Amazon, not in much of Africa by these predictive models, but you live in a super hotspot with your 1,000 species, rah. A lot of this in Asia in this study actually was done by using this as a model because we don't have good data from this part of the world, which we really need. You live in a hotspot, so I was going to say a lot about, I'm just going to say this real quick. This is actually in Israel, but in dry places, you know this. If you put water and build gardens, you get more stuff in those gardens than you get in the wild landscape around you, right? This certainly happens here, and it certainly happens outside of the season because you've really extended the season because you're growing different kinds of plants and you're watering it a lot. You've created an oasis. So you can get huge uptick in biodiversity. This is just one study. This is actually right here, on the Front Range. Things change the bigger your plot gets. If your plot is too small, you don't have a lot of stuff going on in it because you don't have enough space for it, right? I can go very quickly through this. This is just from these authors, which of course people you know. Large native habitat areas surrounded by suburban sprawl may actually increase species richness and species diversity, right? I hope that's not too controversial. You're nodding your heads. It's not too controversial. This is if you go up in altitude. If you're low, this is the flies. If you go up in altitude, you actually go from having bombyliids at the bottom, which are these nice bee flies, to having surfeit flies at the very top. So, and we can do the same thing for bumblebees. As you go up the mountain, you know the whole community changes. Because it's wetter up there, part of their life cycle needs to have...
Back one slide for just a second.
Sure.
Back to that. Yeah, thank you so much.
I'll give you all this later on. I'm just trying to rush here. So things change as you go up the mountain. So where you are really matters. Okay, real quick. I'll finish real quick. I'm going to talk about how to create these landscapes. So we took this perspective that I'm showing you and used this as the basis for building the pollinator garden at Penn State. So what it looks like, this is early in its life, it's only 3 years old. There are 350 species of native plant in this landscape, and quite a number of them we had to derive from nature because people don't grow them. And as those fly plants, you know, they're not very exciting plants. They're very important. We worked with a number of folks, including Emmanuel Didier, who was the main designer. Is Emmanuel here? He's not here. I could tell you a lot about this garden and the whole process. I was the scientific advisor for the pollination side, but of course there are many designers who were involved with this, and it was great fun and fantastically interesting. The person I mostly work with was Claudia Vest at Fido Studio. She is, and her team are certainly some of the best native plant designers in North America. It's quite extraordinary. This garden was not just for biodiversity. That was our commander's intent. We wanted to support all the pollinators based on the science that lived in that part of Pennsylvania. But it also had to be beautiful because we have to communicate to a broad audience. We do a lot of messaging to people and communities. You can't just talk to people who are already into it, right? People who love native plants, because in fact, if you look at the demographics and the numbers, it's a tiny slice of the gardening community. It's less than 3%. It's basically nobody, right? Wait a second, I'm not done with that joke. It's the somebodies, but it's basically nobody. It's really important to have a language and a vocabulary in gardens that speaks to every kind of person. These are all the goals of the garden. It's very lofty stuff. But we are an education institution. Education is a huge part both for our students and then people in our community and then people across Pennsylvania. We have a lot of online resources we're developing right now. I know I'm going really fast, I'm sorry. This is what the garden looks like at the end that looks like, we call it the backyard garden section. It's much more manicured, it's much more under control. There's a vegetable garden here, and there's a lot of exemplar gardens and exemplar plants, both native and non-native, things that don't jump the fence, and also plants that, but all the plants support pollinators in one way or another. They're host plants for butterflies, they create nectar. But this would be an example garden that anybody who gardens could have these plants and they'd be well behaved. It wouldn't be like goldenrod takes over your whole yard, that kind of thing. They are plants that are, and the goldenrod species that are actually well behaved are in there to show people. The garden has different sections. This is the more wild, it ended up being the more wild part. These are not facsimiles of nature, which actually, apparently, according to the designers, make boring gardens. These are super, I know. What happened is I showed Claudia the list of plants we wanted, this deep list of plants. And because she understands plants so well, she looked at the list and said, oh, these are going to go here, these are going to go there, because they're good neighbors as plants. Every soil in this garden is engineered. These are not native soils. We created all the soils. In fact, in this meadow disc in the middle, the soil is made of green roof soil, very low in nitrogen. Because if we put native North American plants that will grow 2 and 3 meters tall in this system, in rich soil, they get 3 meters tall. It's a jungle. It doesn't look like a garden anymore. But if you constrain the nutrients, they stay short, and it's legible to people as a garden. And the way she did this, these are all the points that I was making early on. This is Claudia's reinterpretation and elaboration of these ideas. And she integrated these. You see, she says, focus on generalist species. That's to support communities. We consider the context, we survey the landscape and all these other things. Mostly native plant species, but also these non-native perennials that we've been working with that we know support pollinators, probably in urban landscapes that are pretty compromised to start with, and few things grow there. I'm nearly done. So it was all different species that we looked at. We're trying to support here the butterflies, the flies, etc. I basically gave her my list. She noted in the list what would grow on the site, what didn't need too much shade. There's a site that will eventually become a forest, but it's going to take some years, and the planting will change. And she looked at what was just garden worthy, would work in the garden at all. And it didn't need specific habitats and special habitats, and that's what she used as her basis. But what she did, because she's extraordinary, is the garden is not just planted in big blocks of plants. They had to be interspersed. It's 4 acres in size, but to get 350 species, remember we're trying to max out not just the diversity, but the amount of floral area. That's the most attractive, important thing for pollinators. You got to squeeze a lot of plants in a tiny area. She has a ground cover layer which is used as a green mulch. And there are different kinds of plants she uses to do this. The top layer had the charismatic plants for human eyes, right? So this would be like that Agastache. Very charismatic to humans because big flowers, and it punctuates the garden, which otherwise looks like a kind of meadow. And in the middle layer is where she planted all those little insipid plants with the small flowers that are loved by flies and everything else. So they're all there, but it's not what really humans pick up on, right? So it was a wonderful way to design this. And the design of the garden is to be in your face. Because insects are small, even the meadow disc is tilted up in the back, so when you walk behind it, your face is in the meadow, literally, in the flowers in the meadow. There are places for, this is a honeybee pavilion we created. I can tell you more about that if you're interested in it, because we have those for education. We have these nests for wood nesting bees, which have been crazy, full of bees. I have some students working on this, trying to understand how this works. And this is actually a berm. There's a whole berm built in this. It's quite long. It's a length, maybe twice the length of this room. That was built, the site was quite flat, so we had to create some sort of topographic relief. This berm is sparsely planted, and it's filled with a very specific mix of sand and subsoils that's exactly the kind of consistency that the bees need. We're actually going to do some alterations to make it even more heterogeneous. It's quite a challenge, actually. In Pennsylvania, it rains so much. We get almost 4 times the rain you get, right? It rains a heck of a lot. Everything grows like crazy, and so this has to be kept very sparse. So learning how to manage this, to keep the plants from crowding out the ground, is really very challenging. But I think we're getting closer to trying to understand how we do this. And that is all. So if you want to contact me, that's my contact. Oh, my wife and I wrote this book. It's coming out all the way in June. We're totally done. It's all ready to go, but who knows. It's about the lives of bees. It's beautifully done by Print and Press. It has beautiful, beautiful photographs, bees from all over the world. It's not a taxonomic book. It's about the lives of bees. It's about their natural history. And we're very excited about it. Any questions? Quick?
I think we could take just a few questions, probably.
Could you just expound on the difference between nesting and modular? Just to, I think nesting, but the modular piece is a little harder to grasp.
So these ideas about community structure are very hard to teach. I just gave you a flavor, and if you've got a bit of it in your mind, you're doing well. Because thinking about communities is quite abstract. So the nested thing just means there's redundancy in the system. It's not a random system. If you were to go and get just a group of organisms together and throw them together like in a city somewhere in the world and see what happens, the nested structure is actually very robust to perturbation. They reinforce each other. So if your pollinator's not around, there was been said earlier, pollinator communities, insect communities go up and down every year. There's stochastic processes that are happening. And they will increase greatly some years and be really low. The nested structure creates this redundancy that makes them resilient to perturbation. So if they're random, they fall apart very quickly. I could show you the models. People do this in silico. The nested structure, so the modularity is that within the whole community, which has a nested structure, there are actually certain units that interact with each other more often than not. And oftentimes they have converged phenotypes, such as protein-lipid ratios they want, or resins they prefer, or colors of flowers they prefer. So if you're trying to conserve a community or support one, you have to know both, right? Which keeps these folks in business.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Okay.
So if I wanted to choose those plants, how do I find out what those are for here?
This is the $10,000 question. How do I get the plants and where's the list?
That's the 3 PhD students.
That's exactly. That is something the community is working on. So there's, organically, we're working on it. And we can see that because we have to make these decisions that we need to get better data. There is a future, and it's not here yet, in which this is all in a database. You put your geolocation, you say, I'm here. We've modeled your landscape. We've modeled the structure of the communities. We have ideas, and you'll have recommendations that will show up. We're trying to create this right now. That will show up that has all this kind of information in it, protein-lipid ratios and all this stuff, to help you make choices better.